Hi, good afternoon, everyone who's joined as well. I'm just going to give a few minutes perhaps to let everyone kind of join the call and settle in, and then I'll maybe give it 2 or 3 minutes and we can begin. But thank you very much for being so on time. So yeah, just for anyone else joining, I'm just going to give it maybe another 1 or 2 minutes to let people join the call, and then we can begin. I'll just start sharing my screen as well. Um, Please let me know if you have any difficulties seeing what I'm showing, but we can also make sure that this is uploaded either to the More in Common website or perhaps sent out to attendees after this call. But I think without further ado, I will start because I'm sure people are on their lunch breaks and things like that, so don't want to take too long. Um, but hello, my name is Andrew. I'm a researcher here at More in Common, and increasingly, sort of, I've been looking at doing food-related research, and now this is kind of the culmination of about a few different projects. One second, can you hear me okay as well? That's the one thing that I'm concerned about. I don't know if I've got a colleague watching, so maybe they could message me just to say that they can hear me because I don't want to do the whole presentation Q&A. Fantastic. Thank you, Helen. Um, okay, so this is a culmination of a few different projects that we've done on food and sort of public attitudes towards food. And I thought I'd pull together some of the sort of top line findings to give kind of an overview of how Britons feel about the food system at the minute. And I know that obviously the food system is so large, and there's so many different sort of moving parts and different actors. And I think it's really interesting how for a bit of information about myself, I've previously worked at a number of food charities, and think tanks. And I actually think um, what I've noticed in this research is that the British public have very different views to the food system than the people who work within the food system quite often. And I think it's one of those really classic things that obviously, like, most of how Britons understand food is kind of shaped through daily interactions with things like supermarkets, rather than, necessarily seeing all of the back end and moving parts and things like that. And I just thought it would be quite interesting to gather together some of the bits that I've personally found most interesting since working here at More in Common, and then hopefully pass them on to yourselves to go and take into your work. Um, but without getting into it straight away, I will introduce our 7 segments that we use at More in Common because they're going to be the lens through which we kind of discuss um, attitudes towards food in the UK. And just as a bit of housekeeping as well, I will try and keep this to about half an hour, 40 minutes, so that if anyone has questions at the end as well, we can have time to get into a bit of a discussion. Because I think that's where the learnings quite often consolidate and become most interesting. But so these are our 7 segments. And the 7 segments of the British public that you know, were devised to get outside of sort of normal demographic analysis of the British public. How, in the past you'd say perhaps working class people are more likely to think this, older people are more likely to think this. This is a values-based segmentation, so we don't use any demographic questions whatsoever. We actually just ask people about the things that they believe, the attitudes that they have, and then we put them into different segments to kind of get beyond this left-right split that quite often doesn't work, when we're dealing with the very complicated topics in British politics at the minute. And we actually find that More in Common having a segment-based lens that, brings people's attitudes and values rather than sort of just their simple demographics actually allows us to get deeper into why people believe things, not only what they believe. Um, so I will go through them briefly here, just as a bit of a deeper explanation. So we have our progressive activists, who are kind of interestingly the people who are very highly political. They quite often actually make up a lot of the people who work in sort of charities, probably food charities, that sort of sector. They're the people who are highly engaged, but quite often feel out of step with mainstream political parties. Then we have our incrementalist left. Again, they are a very sort of community-oriented group. They see things quite often through the lens of justice and fairness, but they actually, again, the reason we call them the incrementalist is because they don't believe in this quite radical change that progressive activists push for, and they don't like political discourse that they see as being too conflict oriented. They're actually quite a conflict averse group. Established liberals, they're sort of best summarized by your Cameronite style Tory, so sort of socially quite liberal, but then maybe economically quite conservative. So they have quite a lot of high trust in institutions, and sort of they're actually the most likely to understand the economy through GDP growth, for example, whereas most people understand it through things like how much things cost. So they're quite a data-oriented segment there. Our skeptical scrollers, they're disengaged quite highly online. A lot of the time we summarize them as the segment that have been kind of born of the COVID era when a lot of people became very isolated and went online. We also call them post-political because they interestingly watch quite a lot of political content online. However, they're the least likely to vote. They also skew to them being the youngest and quite often most urban. Then coming to our final 3 segments here, we have the rooted patriots. They can be summarized quite often as a sort of like red wall type voter, often in more rural and coastal settings. And again, sort of characterized by feeling overlooked by metropolitan or Westminster elites. And quite often when people talk about sort of the left behind communities of the UK, it would be the rooted patriots who fit into that feeling of frustration with, how politics is done in the UK. And they're interesting as well, one of the segments who are most likely to say our problems could be solved with sort of common sense thinking. They're increasingly sort of anti-elite and anti-intellectual, and actually think if normal people were listened to more and more, our problems wouldn't be as complicated as they are. And then we have traditional conservatives who very much does what it says on the tin. They're sort of like your Shire Tory. And again, see things quite often through the lens of uh, preservation, conservation. They quite often see British values at the heart of things and are very worried about British values being eroded. And again, if any change is proposed to them too radically, um, they'll kind of oppose that, which is important for the conversation later on. And then finally, our dissenting disruptors. My colleagues are actually working on a full report that delves into the dissenting disruptors because they're kind of the segment of the moment in British politics, is they're the people who are increasingly turning to reform. So again, there's kind of these anti-elitist, but they actually also believe that the system is kind of broken and similar to the progressive activists. Actually, interestingly, they're the people that say, we need radical change. Let's tear things up and sort of start again versus sort of the established liberals or incrementalist left who are more likely to say British institutions are actually worth saving. Dissenting disruptors, on the other hand, are very willing to say, let's begin from scratch. And then this is just a quick outlook. We obviously also track how these segments vote, and you can see the sort of color coding there to indicate who's voting where. So as I just described, the dissenting disruptors, again, crucially, the people who came out and voted leave in the EU referendum, maybe having not voted at previous elections. These people are increasingly turning to reform, as you can see the sort of turquoise color there. And then, interestingly, the progressive activists who, on the left side here, would have been Corbynite, sort of Corbyn supporters, are now increasingly turning to Zach Polansky's Green Party. But again, I can make sure that this is shared if people want to dig into this sort of data. I think another interesting one to reference is actually the skeptical scrollers, how they kind of just follow the most popular party of the time. But again, they actually have quite low voter turnout. So it's not necessarily the easiest one to follow. And another important point to make is that we actually have the three big segments, which are the dissenting disruptors, the rooted patriots, and the incrementalist left. Those each make up about 20% of the population, so 60% in total from those three segments. So again, you can see that they have an outsized impact on electoral politics, and then the other four make up sort of that final 40%, being about 10% each, give or take. And then there we have that just described in a little image. So I think to kickstart our conversation about food in Britain, um, I think food and health are deeply intertwined, and obviously a lot of the time when we talk about interventions in the food system, it's like, sort of like how do we measure success of the British food system? How do we understand the outcomes of the British food system? And I think it's deeply intertwined with public health, and that's really how a lot of Britons understand the food system. And one of sort of the most shocking things that I've seen since working at More in Common is actually this statistic here that we ran on a project about plant-rich eating, which was that almost three-fifths or over three-fifths actually of Britons say that they think current generations of Britain are eating less healthily than previous generations. And actually, only 17% of Britons say that they are eating more healthily than previous generations. I think what's interesting here as well, you can see the traditional conservatives and the progressive activists, two groups of people who very rarely agree on anything at all, actually being some of the most likely to say, look, food in Britain is getting much, much worse. And I think those two groups have different reasons that we'll touch upon later. I think some of this is definitely kind of a nostalgia for the past, but then also a massive impact on this that comes out in our focus groups all of the time is conversations about ultra processed foods. But I think this is a really worrying sign for anyone in government or anyone sort of working in the food sector at the minute, that people think things are getting worse, not better. And again, I'd say that this is the overwhelming sort of barometer of success for the food system in the UK. And then interestingly, there's quite often this dichotomy in the food system of, do you want food to be healthy and sustainable, or do you want it to be cheap and available? And by no means am I suggesting that the food system has to be reduced to these binary options, but I think interestingly, when we actually propose that to Britons, a majority come out and say that they want food to be environmentally friendly and healthy rather than being cheap. And neither of those things, which I think is a really interesting thing to bring to the debate as well. When I think so often, um, and I'll touch upon this later, but well, so often cost is a really important thing in the conversation about food. Britons are actually more likely to say that they prioritize other things alongside just cheapness. And again, um, this is presented in a somewhat different way of, I guess there's different ways of measuring this. This is just a question versus like measuring how people spend their money in a supermarket and things. But I do actually think it's quite a good start for the conversation that Britons are already saying that they're willing to kind of escape just this convenience trap where food has to become the cheapest possible. But ultimately as well, people don't think that access to food is even across the UK. So um, this is by political affiliation, but you can see that Britons are more likely to say that food isn't evenly accessible across rich and poor um, across the UK. And again, I think that sort of shapes a lot of the debate that whilst maybe some healthy food is accessible and available. It's not equally available across the country. And again, I think you can see reform voters there being more likely to say that healthy food is not equally available to rich and poor. And it's only conservative voters who are majorly saying that, yeah, they think it is. And this comes from some work that a colleague has been doing actually on the cost of living crisis, trying to sort of get into what actually, this term that we use all of the time, the cost of living crisis, what is it that Britons actually worry about? Um, And I think really interestingly, food is massively caught up in the cost of living crisis. And I think that's something which is quite easy to forget, or, I think quite a lot of obviously amplified by recent events in Iran, but quite a lot of political capital gets focused around energy bills. But how many, government ministers have we heard recently come out and talk about food and grocery prices? And again, we can see there's some of the statistics here of 44% of Britons saying that they're shopping around more to save money on their weekly shop. 43% say that they're cutting down on eating out, and actually 14% saying that they're skipping meals to save money. That kind of food is really deeply intertwined with the activities that people are taking to help resolve their own financial stresses, but then also food is the number one thing that people worry about when it comes to the cost of living crisis. And then we ask Britons when they make their choices about food and what they buy and consume, what are your priorities there when choosing that? And of course, affordability is really the number one thing that comes out, and we'll have a segment breakdown on this later on. But I think this is something which is like so often, and again, in focus groups, you can really get a detailed discussion of how much people think, overlappingly, there's food is a really complicated thing, particularly if you have kids, you've got to think about the time it takes for you to cook them, how healthy it is, all of these things, sometimes the packaging, things like that. But actually, affordability is like the limiting factor. It's the deciding factor as to whether you can then be able to prioritize those other things. I think is often what comes out in focus group discussions that actually, whilst I may care about organic, whilst I may care about the packaging that it comes in and where it's been produced, provenance, you know what? Eventually, it will be the cost of the food that allows me to prioritize that or not. So I think that's an interesting way to frame this, so that it's not saying that Britons only care about the affordability of food, but it's quite often the thing that makes other priorities possible or not. Um, and then what we can see here that I think is really interesting actually is for a lot of people, where I came from in the sort of overlap of the environmental and food sector, actually protecting the environment is not a priority for most Britons when it comes to the the choices that they make in the supermarket. And I think that for me was a bit of a learning curve that, whilst I'm maybe in the supermarket panicking as to whether my almonds are produced in California or southern Spain, whether they're organic or not, that's actually not a thing that most people think about. Shocking, I know. And then I think this is interesting to have a look at some of the similarities and differences actually across the seven segments. And again, you can kind of see affordability of food, flavor and quality, and health impacts as some of the most recurrent sort of priorities for all of the seven segments. And again, when we're doing public opinion research, it's actually very rare that you see such common decisions coming up again and again. I think an interesting one to point out is that established liberals are actually the one segment who do not have affordability of food in their top priorities for the decisions that they make about food. And again, we quite often talk about them as the most comfortable segment. They're the ones that still vote for or their their support of Keir Starmer's Labour hasn't really wavered since his election, and that's the only segment that's shown that. We've quite often talked them as those that are comfortable and actually, in some ways, quite insulated from many of the challenges facing Britain today. But it's interesting because we know that established liberals quite often hold positions of high office, be that in politics, in government, be that in the civil service. And they're actually the people who, in some ways, are protected from some of the other challenges that people face. And again, I think a really interesting one here is traditional conservatives saying that one of their top priorities is actually supporting British farmers. And again, that idea of deep-rooted sort of connection through food to the environment and ways of life, I think being really powerful with this group of people. Like it's a way of life that we're protecting there as well by supporting British farmers. And I think a really quintessential sort of reason for that is again in focus groups, we quite often talk about, as an icebreaker, what sort of TV have people been watching? The traditional conservatives overwhelmingly watch watchers of Clarkson's Farm. And I think, again, that for many of the public, that's really shaped the conversation about food production in the country. And a lot of people now see it through, what the events that may have happened or the things that may have been done on Clarkson's Farm. And I think that's definitely seen here in the traditional conservatives. And then it was really interesting. I kind of found this question of like we so often talk about healthy food, and I think it probably means really different things to different people, and that's one of the difficulties sometimes that we can kind of have conversations about trying to eat healthy foods and steer the British public towards healthy foods, and there's not necessarily a common language as to or a specific definition. Do you mean high fat, salt, sugar foods? Do you mean fast foods? Do you mean ultra processed foods? And I thought that was an interesting thing to actually ask the public. What do you see as healthy? So this is a net score. Those who answered this food is healthy, minus those who answered this food is unhealthy. And what we see as the top two there are organic food, comes through as being seen as very, very healthy, and locally sourced food actually as well. And then what was interesting for this project we were doing about kind of steering people towards plant-rich eating rather than meat eating, but meat actually came out as being seen as more healthy than plant-rich food. Again, maybe plant-rich food doesn't necessarily have the same notoriety as something like meat, but I thought that was interesting that actually if you're hoping to intervene on the food system and steer people towards a plant-rich diet, you're actually potentially swapping the food that they see as already healthy for one that they view as less healthy. And I think that's where the sort of precision about what interventions you're hoping to make are really, really important as well. Because if you sort of remain using vagaries, people don't necessarily know what plant-rich is, where it's going to take us, but people are quite certain about meat and know that or think that is a very healthy thing for them. And again, I think some interesting bits here are the processed food right down here at the bottom with people saying that they're not very healthy for you at all. And again, I thought sort of food that children eat is quite an interesting one as well. If we think of how we can intervene on a food system level, that people actually don't view the food for children, the food that we create in Britain for children, as very healthy at all. I think is quite strange, and potentially, an area of intervention in the future. And then, of course, this is a major question when it comes to intervening in the food system: is who should do it? Who's responsible for the way that Britons eat currently? And again, I think this is quite a crucial difference kind of between the sector and the public, where conversations about obesity in sort of the sector are very much this systemic view of the beginnings and ends of obesity, the different pressures of the food system and stuff that maybe make it harder for individuals to make certain choices, or the sort of obesogenic environments and things like that. But that doesn't necessarily hold with members of the public. And kind of here again, you can see in quite an obtuse way that members of the public are more likely to actually say, you know what, obesity is an outcome of individual choice rather than something which is outside of control for a lot of people. Um, and I think again that just comes to it's kind of an interesting starting point, and having conversations with the public around obesity to actually understand that this is kind of quite a core starting point for the conversation. And maybe if you're wanting to carry people along with sort of intervention or change in the food system, you sort of have to understand this fact first, that this is actually the starting point for a lot of Britons, that they still kind of have this hangover view of the individualization of responsibility for obesity. But, sort of saying that, I think this is, again, one of the key differences perhaps between sometimes having like polling data back and having focus groups. And actually, I think it's really interesting how our polling data so heavily shows people sort of individualized responsibility. And that's the sort of, 30 seconds thinking about it versus 30 minutes thinking about it. But polling data shows people really blame individuals, but then actually in a lot of our focus groups, once you are in that 30-minute discussion about this, people do go, you know what, yeah, it is like it is an individual thing. It's all about the food that you put in your body. At the end of the day, it's only you who gets to decide what you eat and what you don't. But then also you can see that like, oh yeah, it's people do actually have a lot on. People do have multiple jobs sometimes, lots of responsibilities. Maybe they're looking after kids and stuff like that, and actually sort of um, it's really difficult to make sure to prioritize health. And there are a lot of advertisers out there who do want to sell you products, and then that's an interesting way to actually think that. I think talking about obesity is a really good example of that, of how polling data shows something different to then when you actually dig into the conversation, really get into it. Um, Again, I think this framing, who would you like to be more responsible for sort of rising, or who do you think is most responsible for rising rates of obesity? Again, we can kind of see individuals themselves up there, but then also fast food businesses, processed food manufacturers doing very highly as well. And then interestingly, not very responsible with schools and the NHS. So this is kind of, again, I think there's currently, what I detect in a lot of our conversations about the food system, are this increasing sort of skepticism around big food producers, food manufacturers, fast food vendors. And I think that's really tying in some ways with the sort of low trust era that we're moving into, and that being right across society, that we're seeing a lack of trust in politicians, in journalists, and now it's also these big food manufacturers as well, who maybe don't have your best intentions at heart when they're producing their food. And I think it's summed up quite nicely by this woman Sarah, who says, you know they try to make us think that it's all our fault, but actually, most of the stuff that they put in food these days is kind of artificials, and companies need to take more responsibility for that when our food system is being sort of flooded with these ultra processed foods and highly processed foods. Actually, that's not an individual responsibility thing. That's on those companies and manufacturers. So again, this is kind of altering that question slightly and saying, who would you like to see take more responsibility for the negative impacts of the food system? And I think interestingly here, you don't see actually individuals at the top. And I think again, that's kind of like it's a slightly different question, isn't it? Of like, who do you think is responsible for obesity, and then who do you think is responsible for sort of solving it? And again, whilst I think to a lot of people, it's like, oh yeah, it makes sense that you know, at the end of the day, you're the one who puts the food in your body. It's your responsibility. If you are suffering or living with obesity, but then actually, it's like who has the power to change that? It's these large food manufacturers who potentially have, very sizable profits to them. It's potentially the UK government who should be legislating against all of these things. That's where the sort of who's responsible for versus who's responsible to solve it gives you a slightly different answer there. But again, I think something that shouldn't be ignored is the fact that actually quite a lot of people still view this as like a parenting issue. And I think particularly with those centre-right segments that we sort of discussed, the rooted patriots, the dissenting disruptors, or maybe the right there with the dissenting disruptors, those people do still quite often say, it's an issue of parenting. It's on that family to sort of solve it, and they don't necessarily want to see government intervention. They want to see parents being maybe supported, and education being the way to do it, but not necessarily crackdowns of legislation on big businesses. So yeah, now coming to what or how Britons understand intervention on food, and this is just a simple test that we did, which was saying how much do you support or oppose government intervention, sort of in the abstract, on anything. Then we asked how do you support government intervention on the food system to make sort of the foods we eat healthier. And you can kind of see that those people who are maybe more skeptical of government intervention in the abstract actually start supporting it when it's made specifically about the food system. And I do think that's sort of capitalizing on what we mentioned earlier, where the majority of Britons think that the food system is actually getting worse and worse. And maybe those people, those traditional conservatives down there, those dissenting disruptors who kind of are more anti-intervention across all things, then when it comes to the food system, they're like, you know what, actually it's time to change things, and they are more accepting of government intervention. I think this guy who was actually in a focus group that I led about reform voters and what they sort of thought about the food system. And he says, he's suspicious of regulation for the sake of regulation, but I think it's necessary. He used the term of more like big mother than big brother. And I think as much as that's a very gendered take on the sort of responsibilities in the food system, I thought it was quite interesting to get around this idea of sort of the nanny state. And actually, there's a time when the state can actually be quite benevolent. And is intervening for the sakes of it, rather than just producing more and more regulation or legislation without need. I guess my point being here that it is seen as necessary for the government to intervene in the food system as it's getting less and less healthy intergenerationally. And then this is just to show it by political party that yeah, actually the government supporting people to eat more healthily has majority support, but then crucially, kind of across political party, even those reform voters and conservative voters who are maybe skeptical of that Big Brother style government, actually there's majority support. But interestingly, again, I think this is something that we see in focus groups. Most people have some recollection or story of government intervention in food in the past, be it, I think the sugar levy is one that gets referenced quite a lot. Sometimes the pasty tax, unsuccessful pasty tax, and quite often Jamie Oliver's interventions in the school food system are referenced to people. And a lot of those aren't necessarily seen as having had great success in radically changing the food system. People say, well, across my lifetime, the government's done these 4, 5, 6 different things to reduce obesity, yet, we are where we are. And that's a difficult thing sometimes when you don't have that control to say, like, well, things could be worse. But yet, there is still general support for government intervention to help people eat more healthily. And again, this is just that segment breakdown when we ask people what they would like to see the government prioritize when it comes to food intervention. And again, just importantly to flag their affordability of food in the middle of a cost of living crisis. That is obviously the thing that a lot of Britons prioritize. But then second to that is actually supporting British farmers as well. And I think again, this is kind of coming off of the back of Keir Starmer's very unsuccessful sort of changes to land tax that saw farmers very angry with him. That's kind of I guess proof of this fact that interventions in the food system broadly should be seen to benefit farmers as well. I think if you're picking them as your enemy, it will make whatever change you hope to make very, very difficult. But these are the two major things that I'd say to sort of take into account food affordability, but also they're supporting British farmers. Really, really important. And again, you can see sort of overwhelmingly for the traditional Conservatives, supporting British farmers is the most important thing for them. So then this is just a fun little graph that we did um, about sort of potential policy support versus opposition, and then perceived efficacy in the eyes of the public. I will read some of these out because I've also shortened the names just to sort of fit them in the graph, because you can see there's a bit of clustering around here. So by far and away, the most popular is school exercise. And again, I think that comes down to when people are skeptical of, this nanny state style regulation. Also think that obesity is like uh, an individual rather than a sort of systemic issue. Therefore, things like school exercise programs garner a lot of public support because it's sort of like it doesn't see the government sort of suddenly clamping down on Mars bars being illegal, but also it taps into this idea of the intergenerationality that you can have young people exercising and that will sort of set them up for a fit and healthy life for the rest of their lifetime. I think nutri labels again being very important there, the idea of having um, a more pervasive system of nutritional labeling. Again, when sort of the responsibility um, of of obesity is seen as individual, actually in individual level responses, things that make the consumer more wary, things that make the consumer more educated about the food that they're eating are incredibly popular. I think another interesting one actually is cracking down on some advertising sees quite a lot of popularity and actually perceived efficacy as well. That saying, you know what, no longer allowing these big businesses, these people who make a lot of money from the food system, actually no longer allowing them. I think particularly as well, we've done some work with charities that work particularly on child like advertising to children. And I think that's really popular that people are like, you know what, there are actually young children should not be advertised to. That's not necessarily fair in the same way that we have exemptions around advertising to children for other things. Maybe fast food and unhealthy foods should be fitted into that as well. And then sort of seen as less popular or sort of less effective and maybe less popular here. That's a minimum unit price for alcohol consumption. I personally wasn't that surprised to see that down there. That's not necessarily something that Britons would want to see given up. But interestingly as well, promotions here, people don't necessarily see it as effective to ban promotions. And again, when a lot of people are worried about the costs of food, actually going after promotions, the things that bring down the cost of food for many, is not so popular. And I thought this was quite a wild one that intervention in using weight loss drugs was incredibly unpopular. This data is, I should flag, about 11 months old. So we've actually probably seen an interesting shift there in the acceptability of weight loss drugs. But I just found it really interesting when this was about when the Tony Blair Institute came out in favor of giving anyone with I think it was something insane, like anyone with a BMI of over 25 should be on Mounjaro and Ozempic. And that was at a time when actually Britons didn't view weight loss drugs very favorably at all. And again, in focus groups, there's a lot of skepticism about the long-term impacts on health, but then also some of this like kind of copping out thing that you should go for longer-term dietary changes rather than short-term medical sort of interventions. And then I'll just run through quickly some more specific sort of interventions. And this I think is a really interesting one that reducing meat, sort of a large swathe of Britons actually neither support nor oppose the government taking action to make Britons eat less meat. And it's an incredibly controversial talking point. I think obviously there's been vegetarianism and stuff has been very much caught up in the culture wars of maybe the last, couple of decades even. But I think crucially, what's really interesting here, and what kind of came out from this research was that when recommending to make interventions like that, so often the public ask, well, with what? We're gonna eat less meat, but then what else are we gonna eat? And depending on what route you go down, if it's for sort of rooted patriots, they're quite happy to see maybe meat replacements used as long as they have sort of the same levels of convenience actually as the meat that they would have previously cooked. They're more accepting of, well, I can swap my Richmond sausage with a Linda McCartney and it's I'm cooking the same meal. Versus then you have your sort of established liberals and incrementalist left who are less about the convenience and actually more about well, what's in it? They're more concerned about the health implications of that food, and they want to know that, okay, so if I'm reducing my meat, then maybe I'll be having tofu and sort of whole foods and making it really sustainable. But I think again, it's you're gonna win or lose groups of people depending on what recommendations you then make, be they fitting with their priorities with the food system or not. But actually, people don't have incredibly, there's a lot of people who are undecided on those interventions to begin with. But the dissenting disruptors, the traditional conservatives, more wary of the government stepping in and taking away people's meat dinners. Introducing a high fat, salt, and sugar tax, interestingly, has quite a lot of support. We tested this a few different ways. We sort of said if the money was ring fenced to go off to the NHS, that saw even more support, or even more support than this. But actually, I just think interestingly there is public support kind of right across those segments as well, for a tax on high fat, salt, and sugar foods. I think the one thing that saw a bit less support for this, and this came out kind of in the focus groups and stuff, was actually people not necessarily trusting that the government actually has the ability to make food healthier. And for this, a lot of people said, "Oh, well, the government's going to put a tax on this." But actually, the food manufacturers will just find a way around it. They'll shrink the size of this, they'll do something up there. And that's again a key point of making sure that this goes after kind of food manufacturers and upstream enough for the food to be genuinely changed. That it's like we are genuinely reducing the salt in this or X or Y, rather than sort of the downstream, like, oh, it just looks like we're changing the packaging on things, and then they found a way around it. And I think that again has a big change in acceptability. And as it points out here, there kind of was a slight drop actually in support when we named some of the foods that would be included in this sort of tax. That I think some people in the abstract are quite supportive of it. Then it's actually like if it comes after sausage rolls and the food that people enjoy eating, then it's obviously less favorable. But this is again kind of just illustrating the point. By far, the most popular policy that we tested was kind of this slightly abstract one, but just of supporting, the British government supporting growth in the British horticulture industry. It seems like the win-win-wins here of, Britons already think that local food is sort of the most healthy, that one of their main priorities for the government in the food system is British farming. Actually, just a policy that's shown to improve the lot of British farmers has, massive support kind of across those segments as well that so rarely agree on anything. It has, yeah, it's just a massive win. And again, that's with the idea that potential policy interventions should perhaps see this as one arm or one direction that you could push in. And then this was just again sort of some more message testing type things that we did about action on obesity and kind of just how to frame some of the arguments if we're wanting to make changes to the food system. And one thing that, again, in the qualitative data that came out really was people being concerned about the NHS, and the statistics all of the time about how much obesity costs the NHS per year, and how much time is spent, and actually saying that not only are we reducing that, but then actually that can get freed up to treat people with different diseases that can go to that can be money spent better elsewhere. Not only is it a reduction here, but it can actually be better spent elsewhere, I think is really important as well. And that's what came out in a lot of our focus groups. But then also I think what's important to have a look at is this idea of protecting children as well, that in many ways, as much as you may see grown adults as responsible for their own obesity, actually kind of children is not necessarily so much seen as fair game. It's like that be the government should be doing more to protect those people. But then there's reasons that people wouldn't necessarily support government intervention on obesity. And of course, again, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, that being the cost being passed on to consumers, that's not what people would want to see. And again, sort of another economic one actually of damages to small businesses. But less popular are these nanny state arguments. These are more likely the ones that people are going to pick. But I do think again, one real killer moment for me, as I was running one of these focus groups, was we probably, I mean, probably been about 60 minutes into the focus group, talking about food, government intervention, those sorts of things, and it was a reform voting group. And this guy kind of eventually just goes like, "Oh my God, you know, can't the government just let us have a bacon sandwich?" And I think that's the line where people come to that it's not about the government necessarily becoming this nanny state, but it also shouldn't be seen as robbing people of their simple pleasures. He was saying we'd had this whole long conversation about all the best and worst parts of the British food system here. But come on, we all know it's crap, but a bacon sandwich covered in ketchup on crap white bread is delicious. And like, I don't think that the government or whoever's calling for these interventions should be seen as robbing people of those individual sort of joys, but more overall trying to make small shifts to the food system to make it better, but not blanket bans, and not robbing the things that people really enjoy. But then again, an argument that actually does not have favourability is that it's not the role of the government to regulate food and advertising. So actually, this idea that wholesale, it's not an area for government intervention, it's a personal thing, doesn't necessarily work. And then again, just coming to the end here, and we'll have some time for questions. But again, when we framed intervention, do you think the government's doing enough to protect children's health in the UK? We saw an increase of support from, again, two of those critical sort of larger segments, critical to the debate as well, those sort of rooted patriots, centre right, and the more right wing dissenting disruptors. Those people, a majority say, actually the government isn't doing enough when you centre the debate around children rather than, again, abstract ideas of government intervention. But really with that specific group saying, centering it around children, they're then more likely to support government intervention. But you can see established liberals and interesting traditional conservatives then a bit less likely to support intervention or say that the government's not doing enough. And then this is just a bit of research that I'd kind of actually quite like to do in the future almost, but it's like looking at how people actually understand or how people get their information around diet and well-being. And I think that's sort of a crucial part of the discussion really is like who do you trust to tell you what's healthy and what's not? And I think one interesting thing was 40% of Gen Z said that they get their information on diet and well-being on social media, which is kind of almost twice as much as the general public. But I think again goes to show this like increasing levels of polarization amongst young people in the food system. And I think when you rely on something like social media, the algorithm can kind of really get you into this spiral of recommendations and recommendations. And I think it would be really interesting to do a piece on sort of how, men we're seeing increasingly go to sort of carnivore style diet things. Young women are being more recommended sort of like whole foods, and maybe more environmental diets and stuff like that. And we're actually seeing sort of this bifurcation of the British diet amongst young people based on potentially social media algorithms. And I just thought that was something that interesting that I wanted to flag. That I don't necessarily think, say, the Gen X sort of more policymakers, people who are making the legislation around this stuff. I don't think necessarily are capturing or aware of the impact that social media actually is having on the British diet at the minute. Oh, and then this is just, sorry, I didn't know why I animated it like that. But this is just sort of a summary of the seven segments and how they all kind of differ on food. So I've written a little synopsis here of progressive activists. Again, they're like this hyper engaged, very political, and often very active segment. They're the most likely to say that they want to reduce the meat in their diet. They're highly supportive of government regulation and quite skeptical of big businesses. But then incrementalists left, very supportive of government change to improve the food system, but they don't want this to be as radical. They actually have high levels of trust in the government, and that quite often makes them more supportive of things like taxation, and they're kind of the people that believe actually the government can solve these problems. And again, established liberals, the only people or the only segment of the population who don't see food primarily through the lens of cost. They're more concerned about their personal health and the safety of food. But again, are quite willing to change their diet based on the new information they receive. Skeptical scrollers, I think quite often difficult to find out what they think because they're so sort of, they really do flip between from topic to topic. But skeptical scrollers very online and quite often see their food through the lens of online culture. Thus, this means they're likely to follow the diets they subscribe to. And then rooted patriots, we say quite often that they're the segment that have the highest levels of threat perception. And food is similar to that as well. They can see, and that can be both a blessing and a curse. They can see these big businesses as actually very threatening, pumping children full of UPFs and stuff, or they can see government intervention as very threatening because it's going to push up food costs. And I think that level of threat perception is a key way to see them as either accepting or being very wary of change in the food system. And then traditional conservatives, again, conservation is in the name. They sort of want to see British values and ways of life as being preserved, particularly sympathetic towards farmers and producers in the UK. They would see food and ways of life as deeply intertwined and want to see British culture preserved through our food culture. And then dissenting disruptors, again, see the world very much through individuality and anti-elitism. And again, I think they're also a very low trust group, similar to our progressive activists. And again, some of those things of being anti big food business and things like that, that can win with them. But they also don't necessarily want to be sort of spoken down to by Westminster or told suddenly that they have to radically change their diet because some policy wonk says so. And also this segment are some of the most likely to say that meat is actually a very healthy part of the British diet and things like that. So might not necessarily see what the big deal is behind this driving change in the food system. But again, that's a brief overview of the segments and their attitudes towards food. Thank you very much. We now do have sort of 5 minutes for Q&A. If anyone would like to ask a question or sort of make a comment and open it up to the room a little bit more, perhaps. I'm actually not sure what the best way to do the Q. So I'll just give it a couple of minutes if anyone has. So I'll read the question out from Nicola there as well. Do you have any insights on whether people might be supportive of restrictions on advertising for unsustainable food, not just unhealthy food, such as industrially farmed meat and dairy, or is this concern for? I think you're kind of right there. That I would agree with the kind of second answer or the second part of your question there. That I think whilst Britons are quite um, anti food advertising from a health perspective. I think if you try to frame it as an environmental thing, that 6% of Britons that are really concerned about their food, 6% of Britons who are concerned about how environmentally friendly their food is kind of too low for that to have much support, really. I do actually think as well, most Britons don't think their food is unsustainably farmed. I think again, from the conversations that I have in focus groups quite a lot of the time, there is still this like quite quintessential view of British farming, which is also why it's so broadly supported. Um, and uh, yeah, so I think maybe bringing environmentalism through as like a second or third level uh, priority is a better way to do it than framing it as the key area for intervention. And then, oh, so I've got a question. Are you looking at the above report and linking your work with this, talking to Professor? I've actually not, I've seen Professor Tim Lang speak a few times, but I've not directly spoken to him with this work, but I will make sure to reach out, Brett. Thank you very much. And Hayden, thank you for your question. So we do, we do. There was a graph I can pick and try and pull out for you. In terms of people having emission specific, sort of that environmental labeling, we don't have data on, but we do have data that people are more supportive of further rolling out nutritional labeling. And again, I think quite often when people see if you have sorry, I'm trying to read the Q&A whilst also answering, and I'm getting split brained. But when people see sort of the food system as an individual responsibility, actually food labeling sees kind of quite broad support across the British public, because then it's one of those things that it allows greater agency for members of the public that, you know what, if you have the food, um, if you have the information in front of you presented on the food, then you can make the decision for yourself rather than the government necessarily having to come in and ban this, that, and whatever. Yeah, thank you for all the questions, guys. Do you have insights into how British farmers fall into your segmentation? Really interesting. Well, thank you very much for your kind comments. I also think I think at one point we were looking with the NFU to actually do a poll of their members um, as to where they would fall in the segmentation. But as of yet, I don't really know. I would happily, if you are a farmer yourself, Sarah, if you know some farmers, our segmentation is actually online, and you could ask them to take it, and it would be really interesting to find it. It's like a 10-minute quiz. It asks you about various things, and it would be really interesting to actually find out. Obviously, that'd be quite a small sample size, but it'd be really interesting to find out how the farmers fit on there as well. And Brett, please give me an email. This is actually we pulled together a few different reports for this presentation. Um, we pulled together a few different reports for this presentation, but I can kind of send you some of that if you'd like to share it with Tim Lang as well. That'd be really great. But again, my email is just at the bottom there, andrew@moreuncommon.com, if you want to give me an email, or I can reach out to you as well. Uh, so do people have an association between health and environmental benefits, or are they seen as very separate? Again, I kind of think people don't, again, the British public don't think about the environmental impacts of their food as much um, as they do the health. Health is really, health and cost are the primary lenses through which people come to food. Um, and that's why I think actually, if you do want something environmental, an environmental shift, trying to link it to health is really, really good. I think interestingly as well, people kind of, it ties to one of the questions before, but people kind of think that farming is actually a net good for the environment. I think a lot of people view farmers as kind of stewards of the land. And don't necessarily have this view of like industrial scale agriculture that's potentially really negative. But actually, farmers are seen as people who are being close to the environment and probably net benefiting it. But so I think in answer to your question, they're seen as quite separate things. Can you tell me more about the British horticulture question? How is British horticulture framed versus animal agriculture? So it was a very simple question, to be honest with you, Helen. It was just, we gave them a list of different intervention points, some of which were reducing meat, but one was kind of researching animal protein alternatives, and then one was supporting British horticulture. I think we had the example of like growing cucumbers and tomatoes more in the UK rather than overseas. And again, I think it's just that win-win-win if people see British food and locally produced food as some of the most healthy. They want to support small businesses. and the economy overall in Britain, and that's what sort of have this sort of like runaway favorability. But again, if you want to ping me an email, I can give you the full data set and the breakdown for that. So, did you look at attitudes and support for actions to support people for growing their own food in relation to the profiles? Um, so yeah, that's I will just copy your sorry, I will just copy your email there as well, Brett. But yeah, that's something that we didn't do. We didn't test for in any of our polling, but that quite often comes up in focus groups actually. This idea of allowing people to grow their own food. I think again, when a lot of people think the food system was actually healthier in previous generations, or the health system had better outcomes in previous generations. Um, that was a core part of it, was people producing their own food, and anything government intervention that would potentially push people in that direction has quite a lot of favorability. But on the other hand, I think a major reason why people eat kind of unhealthily now is actually seen as the time pressures that they have. Um, so people don't have the time to necessarily even cook from scratch, and that's a major reason that we all eat so unhealthily. Um, so then I wonder how that would then factor into the idea of making or responsibilizing people to produce more of their own food. When it's like you're already, you're trying to cook an hour a dinner in under an hour and 45 minutes, but actually you've got to go outside and pick the carrots from the garden and everything as well, how that would necessarily fit in with that. But it would be an interesting thing to maybe test more explicitly. I think, we did see a while ago Jeremy Corbyn come out in support of the community allotment in the Telegraph, which I thought was actually really interesting that he managed to land that. Speaking to a very different audience to who Jeremy Corbyn is used to. But yeah, so thank you very much, everyone. I will actually end the webinar here. I hope you found that fruitful and good food for thought. And please do feel free to email me if you have any further questions. And Brett, I'll make sure to get back to you. Um, Thank you very much. And yeah, take care.